The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions Podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode.
Hey, Monica.
Hey, Jennifer.
So Monica, today we're exploring wildlife resilience and we're diving into some incredible examples of animals that have come back from the brink of extinction against all odds. And I just have to say at the onset that I'm beyond excited to share this conversation with our listeners because it's so full of hope.
Yes, and we've explored biodiversity in past episodes, but we've never talked so specifically about wildlife and the role that animals play in the larger ecosystem. So I'm glad we're finally having that conversation.
Yes, and we were so lucky to have Dr. Christopher J. Preston on as our guest. Christopher is an environmental philosopher who teaches at the University of Montana. His writing has appeared in publications such as The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, Discover, Slate, and the Wall Street Journal, Salon, and the BBC. He is the author of 2 books, The Synthetic Age, and a new book, Tenacious Beasts, which we'll be diving into during this conversation.
And I know we say this every single week, Jen, but it's very true this time. But I love this conversation. It was so fascinating to discuss all these wildlife comebacks through the lens of an environmental philosopher. So he poses all of these questions about the right level of human intervention, how much we should rely on technology to help these animals, and how climate change impacts the whole conversation.
Yes, and I would just love to add that we also get into a conversation about how restoring these natural ecosystems help us in the fight to mitigate climate change as well.
It's so good. So let's get to our conversation with Christopher Preston. Christopher, we're so thrilled you've joined us today. So excited to dig into your current book, your past books. But one of the big things that we always love to know is, where did your interest in nature start in your life? Is this new? Is this old? Is this something when you were little? Tell us a little bit about your background and sort of where that nugget started.
Sure, yes. It's not new at all. I grew up on the south coast of England. So picture green fields, fluffy white clouds, sheep, white cliffs, butterflies, songbirds.
Wow.
And I had a dad and I had a brother, both of whom were very interested in getting out and capturing things from nature. So some of these things were shrimp and prawns off the coast, and some of them were bass in the rivers and rabbits in the fields. And so my dad would take us out often at night, actually, and we'd go out and we'd endeavor to capture these animals. And we, with all respect to my dad, we were not that successful. So we spent a lot of time outside. And even though we weren't successful, I was indoctrinated with this idea that they're out there. These animals are out there. And despite the fact I didn't see that many of them, I knew that somewhere out there in the world, there were these interesting, beautiful, exciting wild animals. Scroll forward 20 years, and I went to graduate school in the Western United States. And there I actually really did bump into some of these animals. And some of them were really big. There were moose and there were bears and there were mountain lions. And this excitement really made good on that promise that I'd had in my childhood. And so from Colorado, I was up in Alaska, Montana, and I've really been captivated by animals the whole way through.
Amazing. And now you're not permanently forever, but you're focused in time in Montana, right?
Yep, I live and work in Missoula, Montana, which I love very much. It's a great place to live.
Oh, what a beautiful part of the country. Oh my gosh. If you could be anywhere, that's the place to be, I would think, especially if you're someone who loves nature as much as you do.
Yep, it's pretty good. We got lots of public land around us here, so lots of places to go.
Well, and you're a professor of philosophy. So how did the time outside drive you into teaching, and why philosophy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I heard there was this thing called environmental philosophy, and environmental philosophy really is pondering the human relationship with their surroundings. And so the surroundings here means the surrounding people, the surrounding physical environment, the surrounding natural environment, maybe even the surrounding climate. So I thought, wow, if there's a career where I can sit around and ponder how to be in a good relationship with my surroundings, I thought that's going to be the career for me. So we actually have an environmental philosophy program here at the University of Montana, and it's just a fabulous place to do what I love to do. So it's really a good fit for me.
Were you surprised by what you discovered during this time of being in a space of learning and also teaching at the same time? Were you just in awe of the things that you discovered?
Well, it's certainly exciting to be in a place where I can see firsthand the things that I'm writing about and talking about and the things that I'm discussing in my classes. One of the things I love about where I live is you open the newspaper in the morning, and often on the front page, there's a story about, let's say, a bear eating donuts from the back of a bakery in town one morning. And so the environmental stuff is very present where I live. It's very much in our lives here. And that's fun. I mean, philosophy can sometimes be rather abstract and rather detached from things. But if you do environmental philosophy, it's right here, it's right now. And in a place like Montana, it's very present. And that's obviously very exciting.
That's a great point, too. And Monica and I talk about this often, about the ability to be where you are and study and work in the space of environmentalism or conservation or biophilic, anything. But because I live in New York City usually, so I don't get to be able to touch a lot of things that I read about or study or love. So I can't imagine how beautiful that must be, and also impactful and powerful for you to continue that work, to share that knowledge of being present where you are exactly studying and working.
Yeah, it definitely is. But I don't want to put cities down at all. I mean, there's lots of nature in cities. There's lots of bird life. There's lots of rodent life and lots of vegetation. And also some big animals. Coyotes are showing up on subway trains and in city parks.
Oh, my God.
We Westerners can be a little bit prejudiced, I guess, about our big landscapes. And so I want to put a shout out for the urban landscape and the presence of nature there.
I love that. Well, one of the books that you wrote that I think is really fascinating, this is prior to your current one, was called The Synthetic Age. And so this one talks about what transformations might be ahead for us. Can you talk about how that started? Because I think that informs your current book as well.
It totally does. I was bumbling along in my career, teaching my classes, and somebody suddenly put a bug in my ear and said, there's money available to study the ethics of technologies. So when you're in the humanities, as I am, there's not usually a lot of grant money, not usually a lot of support for this work. But if you're in engineering or the sciences, there tends to be pots of money there. But so I heard if I got interested in the ethics of technologies, then I could do some interesting work during my summers. I could go to interesting workshops, meet fascinating people, doing things that were actually transforming our world. So for about a decade, I got very invested in technology, and particularly the transformation of the world through technology, and especially the transformation of the natural world through technology. So imagine biotechnologies, which literally change the genomes of living organisms. Or imagine climate engineering technologies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these, but these are efforts to change the climate through engineering. deliberately to change it in a way that's advantageous. So here were technologies that were transforming the world. And I started to feel this sense of loss. Wow, if we transform everything like this, what's going to be left of the natural world? What's going to be left of our evolutionary history? It's all going to be gone and replaced by artifacts. And the book title, The Synthetic Age, was supposed to convey the idea that we might enter into a time where everything is synthetic. And this caused me a little bit of alarm and a little bit of concern. But luckily, I realized in the course of doing all the work for that book that nature is resilient, that the wild world hangs in there. And if you give it a chance, it bounces back. And so by the end of this book, I realized there were some good stories to tell about the resilience of wildlife and the resilience of the biological world. And that then became this current book, Tenacious Beasts, these animals that just won't let go and come back real strong.
That's so interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Tenacious Beasts?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that I realized pretty quick is that some of these tenacious beasts, for them to come back, all you have to do is stop killing them. So how about how about this for a conservation strategy, right? What do? Well, we stop killing them and then they come back. And so take, for example, humpback whales. There was a moratorium on killing humpback whales in the 1960s, and humpback whale populations more or less around the world, with a couple of small exceptions, but more or less around the world, have come back phenomenally. They're back to 95% of what they were before whaling began. So we step back, we leave them alone, and they come back. Same is true of northern elephant seals. Same is true of beavers on land here. Same is true of wolves. If you can find ways to stop killing species and just to let them do what they do best, because they know how to do this thing. They know how to recover. They know how to exist successfully. So if we just step away, if we create a bit of space, those species come back. So those are my primary examples of tenacious beasts. They do it on their own.
Yeah, that's so interesting too. I think as soon as you started saying that, I was also thinking about COVID. And those beasts were out on the streets all over the world. They finally were able to say, now we can go back to where we once were and roam the streets freely without being killed or harmed or honked at or anything. So that's really interesting. That was just in my head as soon as you started talking about just let them be and don't kill them.
COVID is a great example. And I saw a study that came out last week where a researcher looked at tracking collars that had been on 2,300 animals during COVID. So the collars were on them for other reasons, right? But when COVID happened, they thought, there should be some interesting data here about what changed. And it turned out that during the initial COVID months, animals moved 75% more than they did before COVID. They just saw this opportunity and they said, hey, I can get around a bit more now. I don't have to interact with these people so much. Yes. And so this massive increase in animal movement, just by us stepping back inside our homes, it really indicates the possibilities out there for animal recovery.
That's incredible.
Well, and I love how you set up the book in sections and you sort of look at it based on the different, I guess, you'd call it topography or geography, some from farms to prairies to rivers to forests. Talk to us a little bit about why you chose to do that. And had you been studying that way, or was it just an interesting way to organize the book? Because I thought that was a great way to enter it. And if I wanted to pick it up and just sort of look at the oceans because I live at the beach or something.
Yeah, I wish I had an excellent answer to your question, but I actually don't. After I'd been looking at these recovering beasts for quite a while, I had about 12 or 15, and I thought, okay, if this is going to be a book, I got to organize this a little bit. And it turned out I just sort of meditated on these species, and I thought, well, there's some farmland species here, so I could put those in a section. There's some forest species, and I could put those in a section, and some ocean species. So I did that, and it turns out there's 5 sections there. What I used those sections to do was to convey a little bit of a deeper message in each of those 5 sections. So as well as the good news of these recovering species, there's a little bit of a subtle message that I try and infiltrate into each of those sections, and it's organized around those 5. So 12 or 15 exciting recoveries and about 5 subtle messages that are embedded in those different sections.
Do you want to dig in on a couple of those? Because I love a book that tells a story, which you're giving these wonderful stories about how you've traveled to different places and discovered these recoveries. But I do love an embedded message. So give us a couple examples of that.
So I'll start with one close to home, and that's the plains bison here in North America. So a lot of the research for that I did pretty close to me here in Montana. So bison have recovered. This is incredibly exciting. They were down to about 340 or so animals at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. They're now up to about 500,000. So that's a success. One measure of that success is the American Bison Society, which was founded in 1905 to protect them. They disbanded themselves after a few decades because they said, all right, we're done. These animals have recovered. So it's a success story, and that's great. But there's a little kind of wrinkle here, a little cautious note to this success story. When you go into the genetics of these recovered bison, what you find is that the vast majority of them have some cattle genes inside of them. And this is a consequence of crossing, hybridizing cattle with bison, most of which took place about a century ago, and it was done by enterprising ranchers who thought bison are pretty tough and my cattle could do with a bit of bison genetics inside of them so that the cattle become tougher. But as a result of that interbreeding and that hybridizing, little traces of cattle genetics have spread out throughout all bison herds in North America. And since I published the book, a study came out suggesting that every single last bison in North America has some cattle genes in it.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't stop it looking like a bison. If you bumped into it in the supermarket, it would be, wow, there's a bison in the supermarket. But they are, in fact, slightly tainted by cattle genes. And so the philosophical question here, the thing that I try to dig into a little bit, is to ask, does that matter? Is it important that a species has its original genetics? Or is this just where we're at right now? So we have to accept the fact that every bison is a little bit cow at the same time as it is bison. And this is the kind of question that conservation biologists might wrangle over. It's kind of a tough pill to swallow if all of your species are slightly compromised, perhaps, if you want to say that, by a different species. So that prairie section digs into questions of genetics and whether we should really get upset about that sort of thing.
Or just the human management, right? Because it sounds like they didn't end up just mating. This was something that was a concerted effort by these ranchers. And so thinking about that human management beyond backing away and letting them flourish, the lynx I thought was interesting that it needed some captive breeding. So can you talk about the lynx a little bit? Because you kind of mentioned like, who are we to play God and change these animals? I think that is from a philosophical, right? It's really an interesting question.
Yeah, totally. So I mentioned the whale. We didn't have to do anything. We just stopped killing it. It came back. But a species like the lynx or the California condor, these are animals where you really have to be involved. And sometimes you have to bring even the last remaining individuals inside into a captive breeding facility. And then you spend a few years building up the population inside, and then you start to put them back outside. This is the opposite of a species where you stop killing it. You actually have to bring it in, nurture it, help it reproduce, gently reintroduce it back out onto a landscape. And then when it's out on the landscape, you might have to watch over it pretty carefully. So griffon vultures are an interesting example. In Italy, when I was there looking for brown bears, I heard about these griffon vulture stories. As those vultures were recovering, the biologists had to put out carcasses, which they called vulture restaurants, because there wasn't enough meat laying around, basically. There weren't enough dead animals on the land that the vultures would have enough to eat. So the biologists had to put animals out on the land, vulture restaurants, so that these griffon vultures could actually have something as they recovered. And so there's an example of intensive management and On the Iberian Peninsula, the lynx, which were down to less than 100, they're now above 1,000. So they've recovered really well. But that's thanks to very careful captive breeding in 5 facilities in Portugal and Spain, and then very careful reintroductions of these animals. And so the biologist has to span the spectrum from being very hands-off to being extremely hands-on in order for a species to recover. And that raises questions about how wild can we let wildlife be, or how involved do we have to be?
Yeah, that's a great point too. And also, have you seen that work that you're doing, also the climate coming into that people are taking action and doing those kind of things and bringing animals inside or changing their habitats and the way they survived before? Did you see because of climate change or environmental changes that they've changed their way of being?
We're not putting animals back into the same landscape in which they evolved. In some cases, an animal's confronting something very different. And so there are philosophical questions here about how much assistance should we give? Should we, for example, help a species migrate to a new environment further north that might be more suitable for it to live? Or should we, if we want to get technological about it, should we alter the genetics of certain species so that they can cope more with a hotter landscape? These are difficult management questions that I think are going to come up more and more as time goes on.
I think it's one thing to sort of, you could say push, or maybe I'll say encourage the animals to go north or south into a more hospitable environment to however their genetics are. But I thought it was interesting that there's a bear, right? And I don't know what the history was, but it needed apple trees pruned so they could have enough food where they lived. Like, what happened? Was there another animal that was pruning those trees naturally for them? But that's fascinating to me. I mean, that is truly going out and not just saying we're going to move you to this area, but I'm going to actually prune these trees for you so you can eat them.
Yeah, I just love that example because in Montana, we're told, keep your apples away from the bears. A fed bear is a dead bear. But in this part of Italy, which is in the Apennines, and this bear population actually is only an hour and a half from Rome. So you can eat some pizza in a square in Rome and then
go see the bears.
Head out and see. And what's more, they're brown bears. It's a species of grizzly, like a subspecies of grizzly bear. But anyway, this species of brown bear was depleted down to only 50 individuals. So they were barely hanging on. And they were at 50 for the whole of the 20th century. So people first started noticing that their population was so low around 1910 or so. Throughout the whole century, that population never grew much above 50 because farmers were frightened of them. And if they came and attacked some chickens, they would shoot the bear. They got hit by cars. They would go after the honey in the apiaries. And people didn't like that. And so essentially people were pretty hostile to them. And enough bears were killed every year that they never got above 50. Now things are improving for them. And this Marsican bear, it's called the Marsican brown bear, their fortunes are being helped by a fabulous organization called Salviamo L'Orso. And the volunteers for Salviamo L'Orso Save the Bear, one of the things they do is they go out and they prune abandoned apple trees. So these trees used to be used by farmers for fruit. The agricultural economy is slightly diminished in that area now. So there's a bunch of abandoned apple trees out there. And what these volunteers figure is that if we can get these bears eating apples outside of town, outside of the valley bottoms, outside of the villages, that's going to be better for these bears than if they're in the villages or if they're in the valley bottoms, crossing the roads, going back and forth. And so the idea here is just give the bears something to eat so that they have a bit of distance from people. And it's working. It's working. Pruning these trees is creating fruit that allows these bears to stay out of town. They've also put electric fences around the chicken houses, electric fences around the beehives. They've been educating people in the villages. There's signs on the road to slow down, rallentare. These signs saying, slow down, with a big picture of the bear. And these bears are starting to increase. Mario Cipollone, who is the bear specialist I met with there in the Apennines, he said, you can be confident there's at least 70 now. There may be a little bit more. And so That's still not a lot of bears, right? 70 or 80 bears. But compared to 50, it's a good start. So these Marsican bears are really tenacious beasts, and we're helping them.
I love that. And I mean, as a percentage, that's a huge percentage increase. So that's really exciting. The other one that I really was curious about is back to the condor. So they have to visit the lab each year to have lead removed. What's going on there? Like, what have we done to the environment that these condors are picking up lead that they would, I've been assuming, die if it wasn't removed from them?
Yeah, the greatest source of mortality for recovering California condors is lead poisoning. And more than half of California condors, of the reintroduced ones that have died because of lead poisoning. So where are they getting the lead from? So these California condors, like the griffon vultures that I was mentioning earlier, they are scavengers. Part of the reason some of these animals got depleted so much is they were misunderstood as predators. They were thought to be animals that were killing other animals. But condors and vultures, they're not predators, they're scavengers. So they eat carcasses. And how do you find a carcass on a 20th century landscape? You find something that's been shot. And that's...
there we go.
I was thinking like roadkill, traffic, but you're right. So there's your...
No, it's lead shot. And so the California condors are eating game animals that have been shot and not picked up. And in states in which lead is not yet banned, they're quite likely to be picking up lead from those carcasses. And it's enough that those California condors literally, there's about 320 of them in the wild, they literally have to be brought back inside every so often and have their blood treated so that the lead comes out of their blood. And it's quite effective, I understand. It can actually, you can save a condor's life by doing this on a regular basis, treated and then re-released so that they can survive this lead poisoning. And of course, there's a solution here. The solution is to get lead out of ammunition, but that's happening slowly. It's not really happening fast enough, and it would be nice to see some changes there.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah, or picking up if you're, I'm not a big fan of hunting, but if you're going to do it, take the game home, or eat it, utilize it, figure out a way to, if you're going to, I live in the country, so a ton of people do deer hunting. It's like, take the deer meat, eat the deer meat. Like if you're going to do it, I think just for sport is not maybe the best.
Where do they go? Where do they go to do this for the condor? Like, is there a specific animal hospital? Like, I have literally no idea. Like, where do they live? How do they do this, and where do they do it?
I don't know the actual places, but there are. I'm imagining like a condor hospital.
Yeah,
with all sorts of
it's on the outside, condor hospital.
Yeah, exactly. They might be connected to the breeding facilities because there has been a very extensive captive breeding program for California condors. But I don't think it's a complicated treatment. You just introduce an agent into the blood, and it helps the lead come out of the blood, and then it's excreted through natural means by the condor, and it's very successful.
Super fascinating. From the philosophical side, I think it's interesting to think about what is the value, because these concepts could seem extreme to people, right? Besides the hands off. And so the question in my mind becomes like, well, what's the value of having these animals? Because we could let the condor go, right? And not do this probably laborious lead removal treatment, but then we don't have condors anymore. So where is your head? And do people take sides on this? Do they feel like it's frivolous? Where do people sit on it? Because I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, these are the questions that keep environmental philosophers awake at night. What's the value of an animal? What's the value of an animal unmanipulated by humans, or the value of an animal where a human doesn't have to intervene, versus the value of an animal where it is manipulated or a human is intervening? And think about the difference between a zoo and a wilderness area. I mean, in a zoo, you're managing, you're intervening, you're really conducting that animal's day for it, basically. You're telling it when it's going to get fed, and you're going to treat it for diseases when it gets diseases. And compared to being in the wilderness, it's utterly different. So these are questions that environmental philosophers have to ask. With the condor, there was an interesting wrinkle here that connects us to one of our other tenacious beasts, California condors used to scavenge a lot on beached whales. So you have these giant birds with these 10-foot wingspans perched on the carcasses of whales that would wash up on beaches. And of course, as whales depleted, there was less for those condors to scavenge. And so some people wonder if, well, that just means that time's up for the condor. But perhaps if we can imagine a future plentiful with whales, abundant with whales, such that they were washing up on beaches, not in bad ways, because there's bad ways in which whales wash up on beaches when they get confused or hungry, but just as a natural part of natural whale mortality, then we could imagine condors having more to eat. And we could imagine all these scavengers out there around the world. If there's more wildlife, if the tenacious beasts keep recovering, then there's more food for scavengers and more of these natural types of systems can return. And then we can imagine a future for a creature like a California condor.
Yeah, and the idea that we would have a bountiful, thriving natural world, I feel like people are, I mean, obviously there's always been people who care, but it does seem like people have woken up, especially during these past years of COVID, a little bit more to the understanding of the benefits mentally to having that connection to the animals. One of the things that you have spoken about, and I grew up in Los Angeles, is the cougar P22, which I think was sadly no longer with us, but it captivated Hollywood for years. Tell me a little bit about your philosophy and thoughts on that experience.
So the P22 case, I think, was really interesting because, yes, it is true that eventually P22 got old and got emaciated and took a little swipe at someone's chihuahua. And you obviously don't want that to happen. But what was amazing was that P22 lived in the Hollywood zip code for 10 years and barely bothered anybody, grew up and put on weight and lived a cougar life amongst all those people. I mean, that's the remarkable thing about that story. Not that it ended with the cougar's death, but that for a decade it went so well. If you can have a cougar in Hollywood, then imagine what other animals you can have in places that you didn't expect them to be. One of the stories I track in the book is the wolf, the recovery of the wolf in Europe. So I didn't tell the Yellowstone wolf restoration story, which is very familiar to a lot of us in the United States. But the wolf recovery in Europe has been phenomenal. The wolf is now in every country in continental Europe. So that excludes the UK because they're not going to swim across the channel. But they're in every country in Europe, including the Netherlands, including Luxembourg, including Belgium, all of these really densely populated countries. And Europe has twice the number of people as the United States. It has half the landscape, and it has more than twice the wolves. So if you do the math on that, you've got more than 8 times the density of wolves in Europe than you do in the United States. And so that tells us something about how adaptable the wolf is, how smart it is, and how it can figure out to kind of stay out of trouble, which is just what that cougar did in Hollywood, is it worked out how to not be a problem, and it could get along just fine doing that. So I think P22 is a really interesting case for how things might be able to go a little differently to what we expect.
That's so interesting. I mean, I just think about all, and again, like these are all things that we're not taught, but you're teaching it and you're learning it. And I think about like, not just like children, but like people our age or anyone else, like, why do you think we should continue to share these stories? Is it about resilience and just also like human resilience in a changing world? I mean, why do you think these stories are so powerful to share?
We've had a lot of stories that are downbeat negative stories. And I think about biodiversity and about climate. Both of these are pretty downbeat stories. And it's a relentless assault of bad news. You can hardly turn on the TV without hearing some bad news. But if you start to get some good news, you can start to feel what that future might be like. You can start to kind of get an emotional hook where you say, okay, maybe this is possible. Maybe this is a world that we can live in. And so I've really been in the business of optimism for the last few years when I've been writing this book, trying to give people a sense of what just might be. And if I can just take a little diversion here into the climate issue, we've just got electric buses in Missoula. And this is great. Electric buses, who'd have thought? So I ride my bike a lot, and sitting next to an electric bus at a stop sign, you realize what an amazing future a city full of electric buses rather than diesel buses would be. They're quiet. They don't pump particulates into the air. When they take off from the stoplight, they just kind of whiz off from the stoplight. They don't growl and boom and make all this noise. So with those buses in Missoula, I get the sense of what that future feels like, and it feels good. It's a future that you want to have. And so I'm trying to do the same thing with animals in this book, Tenacious Beasts, is I'm trying to say, this is what it could be like. This is what it could feel like. And it feels pretty good. And one of the points I try to make is that we like to sometimes find divisions between people. And with recovering animals, of course, people bring up the wolf and you say, oh, well, the wolf is very difficult for ranchers. But actually, I think the story about animal recovery is much more a story about bringing people together than it is about dividing people, because lots of people love animals and like to have them around. And even those people who maybe have some economic burden from having more animals, so I'm thinking particularly of ranchers, for example, in states like Montana, they're not anti-wildlife people, as long as they know that their interests are not going to get completely trampled on by those who want animals to recover, as long as they know that they're going to get compensated, as long as they know that their economic way of life is as important as everybody else's, then there is a common thread of appreciation for healthy, biodiverse, wildlife-filled ecosystems. And so I really try to make the case that animals are something that brings us together rather than something that tears us apart.
That makes me so happy, Christopher, because Monica and I always talk about hope. And we feel like there's so much doomism and so much sadness, like you just said. And we always say, like, our podcast is all about how do we go lead from this space and lead to hope? Like everything about nature and beauty and how we witness the ability to create new is all through the lens of hope through nature. And I love that you see that as a positive way to, how do we get into the next step in life and future. And I do like the idea of those buses. I'm thinking about in my New York City neighborhood, how nice that would be to have quiet buses. Oh my gosh, I'm going to come visit you, Christopher. I'm going to hang out with you for a while.
I was listening to the garbage truck go by just before we got on this interview here, and the garbage trucks are not yet electric. But a garbage truck is actually a great vehicle to make electric. They don't travel very far every day. And the reduction in noise would be incredible. So yeah, I'm all in on electric vehicles.
Well, and I think the awareness, I think the education, like you were saying, that people thought the condor was, and the vulture were attacking and killing things, and they really weren't. People weren't realizing that the result of what they were seeing was actually them scavenging an animal. And the same thing, bobcats, educating people that they think if, first of all, you typically don't see them because they're more of a nighttime and shy creature, but they're so scared of you that they're going to disappear. And so I think education is hugely important, which is what you're doing. And one of the other things that I think, back to the environment, is that the humpback whales in your chapter when you were in Alaska, talking about how the marine environment can help sequester carbon. And again, the more, from having a handful of whales to 500,000, those nutrients that they're feeding on and excreting can boost carbon sequestration. You explain that in the book. Are there other examples in the book that we can look to for hope and optimism that when we bring these animals back or leave them alone, if you will, can make a huge difference in our lives?
Yeah, so one of the points of the book is to, after contemplating these recoveries, think about how they can change how we think about animals. And so I try to develop these ideas of attitudes like partnership or allyship with animals that are doing things that are favorable for us. And you mentioned the whales. It's a really interesting case study where the whales are essentially pooping nutrients, which create phytoplankton blooms, which sequester carbon. And gosh, if we can get some help sequestering carbon, that's going to be a really nice thing for us. Sea otters are another case in point. So sea otters eat sea urchins. And if you can keep the sea urchin population down a bit, then your kelp forests grow much better. And so those kelp forests also sequester carbon. So whales are partners in the carbon challenge. Sea otters are partners in the carbon challenge. Bison on the prairie help restore soils and encourage deep-rooted plants. And good soil and deep-rooted plants gets carbon down into the soil there. So we can start to think of bison too as partners or allies in the climate change struggle. And we can push this in other directions. Beavers, for example, help us restore rivers. They create diverse ecosystems that help fish and insects to flourish. They also help recharge aquifers by slowing water down. And so we want to do all these things anyway. And so if we can learn from beavers, beavers can become teachers to us. They can be experts. And so we look at beavers as having the knowledge about how to provide these kinds of advantages for us. So all of these are attitudes which I was about to say that they're new attitudes. Of course, they're not new attitudes because these are attitudes that indigenous people have had all along, but they are new attitudes, often for settler cultures. And so these animal recoveries, I think, give us another chance. They give us a chance to look at these animals afresh and come up with different ways of thinking about them, different ways of interacting with them, providing us with better ways to think about animals. And that would be a good direction to head, I think.
Well, and it goes back to value. Sometimes, many times, the societal system we're in is looking for metrics. They're looking for ROI. And just to say, well, don't we want to just make sure that we still have these animals for our kids or our grandchildren? Don't we want to make sure that they're still here? People sometimes want that sort of value. So I think if we can educate not only what they're doing, what their natural habitat and behaviors are, but to your point about the benefits, and not that an animal has to have a carbon benefit, but sometimes, especially in these days, that gets other people over the hump, right? Because we all come into these conversations with a different point of view. Obviously, we want people to love animals just for their own sake of the animal. But I do think it's wonderful that we find these, and they're not really, I guess, unintended consequences or really intended consequences are phenomenal. It's almost like you were talking about geoengineering, whatever, throwing particles up in the air, and we're going to, I don't know, stop the sunshine and bring the heat down. God only knows what that's going to do. But is it almost like these are natural geoengineering? I don't know.
No, they totally are. So the whale specialist I went out on the water with, she said, yeah, you can drive a boat around and you can throw iron powder off the back. And throwing iron powder off the back of a boat does help phytoplankton to bloom. And that does help, possibly helps with some carbon sequestration. But if you got the choice of doing that or recovering hundreds of thousands of whales, which one would you choose? It seems kind of obvious which one you would choose. And in part, and she pointed this out to me, the form in which the nutrients hit the ocean through a whale is a much more readily available form than the form in which the nutrients hit the ocean when you throw them off the back of the boat out of a sack of nutrients. Sure. So yeah, the whale is the way to go.
And how did you get the iron powder there? And what was that whole carbon footprint versus a much more natural way to go? I do think that sometimes, and I'd be curious with all your technology work, that some people can think we can kind of technology our way out of this. Like, it's going to be fine. Keep flying your jet and doing all your things. Something will come and we'll have a technology that will fix it all. When really there are these phenomenal biophilic solutions right in front of us. And so I'm sure that first book in the synthetic age and this, coming together are a wonderful marrying of what the future can look like in a natural way.
Yeah, definitely. They're totally connected. And I would get in trouble a little bit if I overplayed the idea that the natural solutions can solve the whole deal. It is important to say, yeah, we need some pretty advanced technologies to do things like increase the efficiency of solar panels or increase the efficiency of batteries for energy storage. So it's not like anything I say is anti-technology. But
Sure.
what I do like to say is there are a lot of natural solutions that we should be doing anyway, because they're win-win solutions. Then they're things where we get the carbon benefits perhaps, and we also get the whales or the beavers or the bison, you know, who would not want them? So I think the win-win is the way to look at these solutions.
Such an understanding, like you just said, that education is so key, because you're like, oh yeah, I get it. Like technology is great. We need it, but we need the biodiversity. We need to learn from the animals, from the creatures, from the land, of how things have been worked for millennia. There's a reason these animals have survived for as long as they have too. It's really, truly phenomenal.
Absolutely. I've come to think of biodiversity as this safety net, this web that is woven around us. And we've cut a lot of strands in that net. And it's nice to see some of those strands rebuild, because it gives us a little bit of security. We're surrounded by something intact and healthy and diverse. And we want it to be that way, I think.
I love to think of it that way. Biodiversity as a safety net. I think that's phenomenal.
Beautiful.
If we thought about it that way. So what's next? I know the book just came out. We'll put it in the show notes. Everybody should definitely go get a copy. But like, what's next for you? What are your thoughts? What are you thinking of next? Or are there students that are working on projects that are really interesting?
Well, I'm very keen to keep talking about wildlife and keep telling positive stories. One thing I'm sure about is that whatever I do next, it's going to contain positive stories because I've had enough of the negative ones, and positive stories are the way to motivate people.
Agree.
I do think we've touched on it a little bit. These questions of carbon and how to get carbon from up there to down in the ground or in the ocean, it just feels like that's going to be a challenge for at least a century to come. And like we mentioned, there'll be some technology involved, but there are all of these win-win solutions. And I also think, I mean, philosophically, everything I do has a surface level to it, and it has a deep philosophical level to it. I think philosophically, thinking about how to get carbon from in the air down into the ground or into the ocean really demands from us a real look at who we are as a species. You know, are we an engineering species, or are we just one of a bunch of living organisms doing our best to make this world a healthy place? And I think in some ways, the task of capturing carbon crystallizes that question and demands from us, who do we want to be in the future? Do we want to be a species that encourages fellow creatures to flourish so that they can build those safety nets around us? Or do we want to be a creature that says, I know the answer to this, the answer is technology, and everything else has to take a back seat? And so I'm just kind of noodling around a little bit at the moment on these ideas of how the carbon challenge makes demand of us and asks us to answer some fundamental questions about who we are.
Wow.
I like that.
I do too.
That the carbon is asking the question.
Yeah, I think so.
No, I think that's really interesting. One of the big things that's been kind of hot lately is mushrooms, right? Obviously, beyond taking them, that the intertwined network, right? And I kind of think of us as a species as our own intertwined network. And so I'm sort of also fascinated with, where are we going to go? We're learning something new every day. It's all interconnected. And so, yeah, I really like the idea of how is the carbon, or what is the carbon challenging us? Yeah. You know, you're sort of flipping the script there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of different directions this could go. I mean, the future is going to be complicated, but it's also going to be interesting. We're going to find really interesting ways to solve some of these problems. And there's great minds working on these things. And there's obviously youth who are engaging these issues in ways that people haven't been before. We're going to come up with some good solutions here. So let's make these solutions as much of a win-win-win solution as we can.
I love that.
You've got the next generation. You know, you're teaching them.
They teach me most of the time, actually, but I do love that I have the opportunity to stand up in the classroom with bright young minds who are really concerned about these issues.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, where can we follow you,
support you
on social media, support you? Definitely, everybody needs to go buy the book.
Well, I have a webpage, ChristopherJPreston.com, and I'm on Twitter at Synthetic Age. I made that my Twitter handle when I was in the middle of writing the first book, but I almost feel like I should change the Twitter handle now because I'm not all about a synthetic age. I'm about a natural age. But yeah, synthetic age on Twitter, ChristopherJPreston.com. And I got a blog with some animal stories up there at ChristopherJPreston.com. So
perfect. So
Wonderful.
They can follow that as well.
Well, Christopher, thank you. Yeah, this has been Monica and I could talk to you for hours, but we appreciate your time and your knowledge. And this has been so fascinating. I have just learned so much in this conversation that I can't wait to dive even deeper into your work and follow you and your continued work. So thank you really for your time today.
Well, good. Thanks very much. This has been a lot of fun for me too. I appreciate it.
Okay, I thought that was so fascinating. I guess my biggest takeaway was the conversation we had in the second half of the interview, where we really talked about how wildlife restoration can have all these positive impacts in terms of climate and resources. That aspect really drove it all home for me in a way that was really effective.
I completely agree. You know, the example of the California condor needing pretty substantial human intervention due to lead poisoning is a really good one. On the other hand, the recovery is amazing, and I applaud the scientists who are aiding that recovery. But if the whale population in that area could recover to the point where we have naturally beached whales, I know we don't want any whale to beach, the population could really support itself. It's a perfect illustration of how these seemingly totally unrelated species depend on each other.
Right. And speaking of whales, I quite honestly had no idea that whales can play such a crucial role in sequestering carbon in the ocean. And then he gave examples like the sea otter eating urchins that help support kelp forests, which also sequester carbon. Bison restoration also restores soil health. And again, you sequester carbon that way.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by all of those examples. And I was really happy to hear Christopher point out that science and technology are going to continue to play a big role in solving climate change. But at the same time, we should be looking towards these more natural ecological solutions as well.
Absolutely. And related to that, I think the other thing we should highlight is shifting our outlook on wildlife in general and viewing them more as partners and allies. Christopher is really quick to point out that indigenous cultures already have this perspective, but it is less common in the West, and we really need to work on that mindset shift.
Yeah, and I think these examples he gave help do that. So we highly encourage you, go out and grab a copy of Tenacious Beasts. It's really good, full of hope, which of course we love.
I'm also so excited to hear more about his upcoming work on what our response to climate change says about us as humans. We'll definitely keep tabs on that and keep our audience updated.
Absolutely. All right. Talk to you then.
Bye, Monica.
Bye, Jen. Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.